Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. A real honor for me tonight to introduce you to Joanna Goodman. She is the author of best-selling novels, The Forgotten Daughter, The Home for Unwanted Girls, and The Finishing School. Originally from Montreal, she now lives in Toronto with her husband and two children. Joanna grew up in Montreal as the daughter of a French-Canadian mother and an English-speaking father. She was very young in 1980 when the Parti Québécois first lost the vote for Quebec sovereignty. Years later, in 1995, she returned to Montreal from Ottawa with a French-Canadian boyfriend, now her husband, while political unrest stirred again. She was inspired to write The Home for Unwanted Girls while living in Montreal and working for Reuters when she witnessed a small riot break out at the Quebec referendum no headquarters. To quote in the Montreal Gazette, what was conceived as a story inspired by her mother's Montreal youth in a mixed French, English, Catholic, Protestant household evolved organically into a bigger canvas that takes into one of the largest, darkest chapters in Quebec's history. You know, it's going to be really interesting talking to Joanna about this because I just came back from Montreal yesterday. Joanna, I was born in Montreal, grew up in Montreal. My family left not because of Duplessis, but because of a lot of the FLQ issues and separatism issues. Like a lot of other Anglo families, moved to Toronto. My family was very involved in Montreal society and the Montreal port and the University of McGill, etc. And there's none of numerous different cousins left in Montreal. So it's kind of interesting. I've got that connection with you. But I think in addition, the two books that you've written have got something to do and a connection with a lot of the news that's going on of late in regards to orphans and residential schools and things like that. So how are you? Welcome to our show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. So maybe just start out, what inspired you to write your first novel? You were working with Reuters as a reporter?
I was an intern. So this would have been in 1995. I was in my last year of journalism school in Carleton in Ottawa, and I was interning on the Hill. And of course, it was the fall and the referendum was brewing. The referendum was in October of 95. And so because I spoke French, I was covering a lot of events for the we side, with the yes side in Gatineau and around Ottawa. And I knew I was going to tell this story. I mean, let's back up a bit also to my childhood. My mom, as it said in that Gazette article, my mom was half French and half Anglo. Her mother didn't speak a word of English. She had been a maid, very, very, very poor, grew up in Hochelaga with dirt floors. And my grandfather had a seed store, as in the book. And he was known as the seed man. He was educated. He was English. He was a merchant. And these two opposite worlds married and had six kids. Six kids. And I mean, language and religion was from the day she was born. In fact, she passed away. Her name was Margaret, but my grandmother refused to spell it the English way, and my grandfather argued for the English way. And so when she was baptized, her name was spelled a combination of both. So she was Margueret. So it's the French and the English spelling mixed up. And that was pretty much how it was with everything. My grandmother wouldn't speak English in the home. She only spoke French. So the kids didn't learn English till they went to school.
Right.
But my grandfather insisted that they be educated in English. So all six of them sort of arrived in kindergarten not understanding a word of English. And they grew up in the East End of Montreal. And so when they went to school, my mom was called pea soup and a frog and a Pepsi. And then when she got home to her French Canadian street, she was called a maudite anglaise. And, so she talked all through my life about this, dichotomy and this identity crisis that it really impacted her, and never feeling like she belonged. And I mean, I remember, with six brothers, I had a whole lot of cousins, and we would all get together, this great big family, and they would, sort of laugh and reminisce about this growing up this way, half French, half English, half Catholic, half Protestant, and laugh about it. But I know with my mom, it was like a wound. And then I grew up in 1980s and 90s Montreal, when it was very contentious. There was a lot of hostility. It was around the constitutional talks. They were never ending. Everybody, outside of Quebec was annoyed with Quebec. We had already had a referendum in 1980. And so it was my experience too, because I went to English school. My first language was English. And although I spoke French, I was English. And if I would walk into a store and order in English, I was met with hostility. I remember, as in The Forgotten Daughter, there's an incident where a customer orders in English. And that happened to me. I ordered a quarter pounder and I was told to go in another line where they spoke English. So it was, the tension was high so it was a story I always wanted to tell. I wanted to tell, starting with my mom's life growing up in the 50s. She often talked about Duplessis and he was like a tyrant and a scary figure. And so I started researching that era, which would have been the 50s in Montreal. And that led me.
Often thought to as what, the Quiet Revolution?
The Quiet Revolution began when Duplessis died.
Oh, okay. So this is the Duplessis era.
The Duplessis era was the 40s and the 50s. It was called the Great Darkness. And he was very, very, very deeply connected to the church and very committed to keeping Quebec backwards and uneducated and religious, and very, very committed to the rural way of life. So that period was called the Great Darkness because, he was not a very good man, but also Quebec really, really, really fell behind on education and growth and development. And so by the time of his death in 1959, he had been premier off and on for almost, I think, 2 or 3 decades. And then Lesage came in, and that was the Quiet Revolution that was started in 1960. So my book starts in the 40s. And the main character would have been my mom's age. And my story was going to be a love story. French boy falls in love with English girl. And it was going to be a simple, sweet love story. But then I stumbled upon the story of the Duplessis orphans, and I was literally blown away, not in a good way. Having grown up in Montreal, I had never learned about it. I'd heard the words Duplessis orphans, as in the culture, and in the 90s when I was in university, it was in the news a lot because they were protesting and they were filing lawsuits, but I never dug into it. So I just assumed that it was that they were orphans who had been abused, which was true, but I didn't know the key piece, which was that Duplessis in the early 50s, made a law where he converted all the orphanages in the province into mental institutions.
Really?
Yeah, and converted all the orphans. Converted's probably not the correct word, but basically they were pulled from school, all education stopped, and they were declared mental patients. So if the kids were in an orphanage, for example, bars would have gone up on the windows, and this happened on one day. It was called Change of Vocation Day, and the kids were all sat down, and the nuns announced that, from now on, this is a hospital. There will be no more school, and you are mental patients here. And they started bringing in actual mental patients, and the kids started working and taking care of the mental patients. And they had doctors come in and kind of falsely diagnose them. They would interview them for 5-10 minutes, ask them a bunch of questions. And of course they weren't very educated. So, maybe they didn't know how to count to 20 or whatever, but they would have been declared, their documents would have been falsified and declared that they were either mentally insane.
This is just people that were orphans, kids that were orphans.
Yeah, orphans, healthy, Quebec. Intelligent,
in
healthy,
Montreal,
normal. Yep. All over Quebec.
That were all of a sudden considered mental patients.
Overnight. Yeah. Overnight. And thousands of them. And then from there.
Seriously? Thousands and thousands?
Yes, I'm surprised you've not heard of that. I mean, I shouldn't be, because I toured with the book for a couple of years and no one had heard of it, but it still kind of shocks me. And listen, I grew up in Montreal and I never knew the story of what actually happened. But I mean, the whole reason for doing this was the subsidies for mental patients were triple what they were for orphans. And so the provincial government and the church stood to benefit. I mean, in the end, it worked out to be millions and millions. Like, I believe they calculated at $70 million profited off those conversions.
The subsidies from the federal government.
Yes, for
Oh
each
God.
orphan, because as a mental patient, so what you had was a collusion between the Quebec government, the Catholic Church, and the doctors. Because the doctors were brought in and they were ordered by both the government and the Catholic Church. If a nun said to a doctor, "You're going to do this," they did it. And that was the end of it. So you have
and what happened to these kids?
So the kids, so if they were in an orphanage, the orphanages became hospitals. And then what began to happen is they just started shipping orphans off to actual mental institutions. So there were a whole bunch of hospitals all over Quebec, obviously, that were institutions that actually housed actual mental patients.
Would the kids escape, or would they be stuck there for their lives?
They were there for life, or until, they would reach their 20s and then go out into the world with no skills. And, what happened to them in their time, I mean, it is horrific. It's really horrific what happened to them. They, and I think this is, to go back to your original question, like, this is what's relevant to what's happening today and what we're seeing in the news with these residential schools. It's very similar. These orphans were sort of mixed in with actual mental patients in these asylums, and they were beaten. They were given electroshock treatments. They were lobotomized. They were tranquilized every day of their lives. They were put to slave labor. In those days, they believed that orphans were, worthless. Their lives had no value. It's a Catholic province. And in the 40s and the 50s, an orphan was, as they said, they were lucky to have a roof over the head. So, I mean, these kids were chained to pipes and beds, and they were abused. And
how could people do this, particularly, maybe I shouldn't be saying this given the news of the last couple of months, that's only reaffirming the news that we've known for a while. But how could religious people do this?
There's no answer. There's truly no answer. And even in cases where, in my research, there were cases where parents who got back on their feet, or who ended up, ultimately getting married, went back to get their kids at these orphanages and were told they were dead when they were not dead. And those kids ended up growing up in these places. So, I mean, by the time they got out, and this went on until the early 60s, by the time these people got out of these institutions, if they hadn't been, brain damaged before, 18 years on tranquilizers and electroshock and beaten and brain injuries. And I mean, they were, and no education and no nurturing. These people have led really, really, really hard lives. And so they would have started being released in the 60s. And in the early 90s. So, all that to say, the story that I had intended to tell about growing up French and English, when I came upon the research about the Duplessis orphans, I just really knew I had to tell that story. And I decided to have my main character, who was inspired by my mom, have a child out of wedlock. Not my story, but that's where it sort of veers into fiction. Have a child out of wedlock who winds up in that system. And so Home for Unwanted Girls is really the story of this mother and this daughter, Elodie, who grows up first an orphanage and then gets transferred to a mental institution, and then comes out in the 60s. And it really explores that mother-daughter bond and the search for each other, and do they find each other. And then in the second novel, which is the follow-up, The Forgotten Daughter, I really wanted to explore the 90s. Like originally I wanted to cover all of it in one book, but
Right.
it was too vast. So I broke it out into 2 books. And so The Forgotten Daughter really picks up in the 90s. And I wanted to show the story of the redemption part of the orphan story. In other words, in the 90s, the actual Duplessis orphans they formed a committee. And most of them didn't read or write, so you won't find a lot of written material about them. But there was one orphan who had gotten out very young because a nun had recognized that he was super intelligent, and she got him out and she got him into a family at a very young age. And I believe he is on record the only Duplessis orphan ever to have had an education. And so he became their representative, and he sort of led this coalition in the 90s, and they started protesting and they were picketing, and what they wanted was compensation and apologies from the church, from the doctors, and from the government. And they fought for years and years and years and years. And finally in the early 2000s, the provincial government made a sort of apology that was sort of, we apologize for what happened, but the nuns were doing their best. And then the church would not give an apology. And when they finally won some compensation in the courts, it came to about $10,000 to $15,000 for the 1,000 or so that were, allowed to receive this. They had to sign a document saying they could never go after the church, and they would never get an apology from the church. And that was the end of it. If they took the money, it was over, and the church was completely exonerated. And many of them took the money. They would have needed the money. They would have been in their 50s and 60s by then and not healthy. And so they've never, to this day, not only have they not had an apology from really anyone, a meaningful apology or real compensation, but nobody knows about it. It's never talked about. It's never, and when my books came out, people were like, oh, well, now people we'll start talking about it. And I have not seen, like any kind of tipping point happen with that.
Is this gentleman still around that you talk about that
no,
led the charge?
No. He passed away a few years ago. There was a lawsuit that was filed in 2018, a class action lawsuit led by an orphan, one of the orphans who is still alive. And it was dismissed in the courts. And I found out today, right before you and I got on this call, that it was appealed, and in appeals, they've actually decided it can go forward. And I have a feeling that this decision is motivated by what's been happening in the news, which is great. Like I think the time of letting these things be buried without any kind of acknowledgement,
is over.
Hopefully. So this lawsuit seems to be back on, and it's representing 1,400 of these living orphans who are really quite old now.
Joanna Goodman is a author of numerous different books. The Home for Unwanted Girls is one. We're going to take a break and come back more with Joanna in just a minute. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm stumbling because, frankly, I was not expecting this conversation tonight with Joanna Goodman. When I read some of the reviews of the book, it almost sounded like it was a love story. And we'll get to, I guess, your second book in a second. But what a shocking description, Joanna, that you've given us of the Duplessis orphans. I just want to get you to talk a little bit about, this home for unwanted girls. It centers around a English-French relationship that occurred, and then a teenage pregnancy. And teenage pregnancies in the 1950s must have been shocking into themselves.
Absolutely. Especially in a, Catholic province. And in the book, they're in a rural, a small town in the Eastern Townships.
Right.
So there would have been, what people thought, and you did not keep your baby when you got pregnant in Quebec in 1950.
You say the book talks about the triumph of family. Why does it talk about the triumph of family? Sounds like it's almost the opposite of that.
Well, the book it's so interesting because it did start out as going to be, I wanted it originally to be a love story. And in fact, it is a love story, but it's a love story between a mother and a daughter who do not grow up, who do not grow up together. Like the daughter does not grow up with her mother. And also the main character, Maggie, is 15 when she has her. So she also grows up with this void left by the child she gave away. And so when Maggie discovers in the news what has happened to these orphans, because it was made public. This was not a secret in Quebec. It was in the newspapers that there was going to be this conversions, that all the orphanages were being converted into mental institutions. And so in my book, Maggie sees this and realizes that her daughter is quite possibly going to wind up in this situation. And so, I don't want to spoil the ending, but the book goes back and forth between Maggie and her daughter's life, and it's rough, the daughter's life growing up in the orphanage and then the institution, but they're both searching for each other. They're always searching for each other, and so I think the triumph is really in their, that bond and that love, that maternal love that is really unbreakable. And so without giving too much away, it has a hopeful ending. It has a hopeful ending. And also that's so much why I wanted to continue on with The Forgotten Daughter. I wanted to continue that story of
tell us a little bit about that.
The Forgotten Daughter is more, so if the Home for Unwanted Girls was my mother's era, which was the 50s and 60s, The Forgotten Daughter was my era. Like that's, the 90s was where, it was a lot easier for me to write this one because the research was memory. First of all, my main character is a journalist, and I was a young journalist in the 90s. And I have everything I've ever written as a journalist. I had saved it all, every story I ever wrote about the referendum, the stories I wrote about that big rally. So for me, writing The Forgotten Daughter, it was such a trip down memory lane. I was like just rereading what I had written about the rally. I don't know if you remember that rally, but
We heard it's huge no rally.
Yeah, we came from all over. I came from Ottawa. We were really there to vote in the referendum the next day, but there was this huge rally downtown and people from all over Canada. It was really cool. And I had forgotten, it was such a moving day, such a moving experience. And then also, I was at the No headquarters the night of the referendum. It was like so intense as we, won by like a thread.
Yeah.
And I came out of that, the headquarters that night, and I walked right into a riot. A young crowd of young people were coming up from the Yes headquarters. And we were all coming out, all the No supporters were coming out of the No headquarters. I had been covering it for Reuters as an intern, not on my own, but I was there to call anything in that happened. And I remember walking out, and the kids from the, Yes side were in the street on St. Catherine, and they started throwing bottles and bricks, and they were so angry. And I remember calling it in to my editor in Ottawa, and he was like, just stay with it and see where it goes. And so we did. And what happened was there was a young guy, he was probably my age, which was, 22 or 23 at the time. And he was on his knees being arrested. And he was saying, c'est pas fini, it's not over. And I was so moved and so impacted by his passion for the province, for the politics. Like, I just was floored. And it was like in that moment, I knew I was writing that story. Like, that moment for me was like, I have to tell this story. And so while originally it was going to be part of Home for Unwanted Girls, it then became the primary theme of The Forgotten Daughter. So The Forgotten Daughter is a love story between a journalist and his very, very rebellious French Canadian girlfriend, who's the daughter of an FLQ, one of the terrorists fictional terrorists who I inserted into the actual FLQ terrorists. So there were originally 4 FLQ members who murdered Pierre Laporte. And I inserted a 5th, who is the father of my main character. And so she's, she smuggles cigarettes as they did in the early 90s. She's, she lives outside the law.
And is this again an Anglo Francophone marriage or relationship?
It's less Anglo because the journalist's main character, though he is a no supporter and speaks English, he works for an English paper, he is French. So they're both actually French. This one is more political divide. Okay, and it's happening alongside the referendum. And so, which digs this wedge, and he's very self-righteous and very much about keeping the country together. And she's the daughter of an FLQ terrorist who is passionate about separation. And I really wanted to explore both sides of that because that's how I grew up. My husband is a pure laine French Canadian. And although he was a no supporter, many of his family members were ardent separatists. And I have had many an argument with them, but I will, as well as my grandmother was. So I felt like I could present both stories without being biased in the book. And although personally I voted no, I was committed to, presenting Veronique's story as objectively as I possibly could. Because I do understand their story. I do understand why they wound up where they wound up. I do understand why they were angry. Why
were they angry?
Pardon?
Why were they angry?
Oh, well, I mean, the French Canadians were the second-class citizens of the province well into the 60s and 70s. I mean, they were the factory workers. They were the blue-collar workers. They were, and in their mind, they were the oppressed ones in their own province, like in their mind, well, not in their mind, but this is true. They are the vast majority of Quebec. I
read a book once that described them as the N-word of North America, or the N-word of Canada.
North America. That book is, I mentioned that book in my book. Now I would never go as far as to even agree with that. However, the point of that book was to highlight the fact that it was a French Canadian province. They were the pure laine. It was their province, and they were the oppressed majority. And the Anglos were the business people and the politicians, and they really ran the province.
But how did they run the province when Duplessis was French Canadian and the Catholic Church ran the province?
That was the problem, because in Duplessis running the province, his mandate was to keep them uneducated and backwards. And so they were not getting educated, so they could not get the jobs and they could not make the money. And so the people who had money were all the Anglos in Montreal, who were lawyers and doctors, and they were educated. And the French Canadians were not educated. And so the jobs they took were factories, farming, and taxis. That was all that was available to them. And that's where Duplessis, although he was French, that's how Duplessis wanted it. He benefited from their, in a way, by their oppression. And it wasn't until 1960 when Lesage came in, and then you started to have the FLQ starting to form in the early 60s in different, it wasn't called the FLQ at that point, but then you had the PQ form. And that was a huge turning point, 1976. The Bill 101 was a huge turning point for the French Canadians. But they were horribly mistreated in the factories. It was their frustration was born not just of how poorly they were treated, but that they felt it was their province. And they were, so powerless in their own province. And all the language laws and the constitutional talks, and yes, I understand it got wearying for a lot of people, but had they not done that, I don't know that they would be as healthy as they are today in the province.
Are they healthy? When I think back to 1967, Montreal was the center of Canada. It was the site of Expo. It was the financial capital of Canada. It was the business capital of Canada. It was the economic capital of Canada. It was the cultural capital of Canada. It was oftentimes the political capital of Canada. And it seems to have, from a whatever standpoint, gone down since 1967.
Absolutely. Sorry, just to clarify, when I say healthy, I don't mean in terms of the province or the city of Montreal. I mean the French language. The amount of French people, and that Bill 101, where if you immigrated to Quebec, you had to put your kids in French school. That to me was a big turning point in why the French language is still the majority. Like, I'm not sure there would be as much French as there is now. Because
let me challenge you that just for a second, and maybe we're getting too political, but I have found in my travels, both politically as well as in business, that the whether you call it the upper class or the upwardly mobile francophones make sure their kids speak both English and French, because they know for them to be successful, they need to be bilingual. And a lot of them will send their kids to university in Ontario or in the United States. And it is almost like they're being Duplessis again, in that they are too often forcing the vast majority of other francophones to be unilingual francophone, which holds back their economic opportunities and their opportunities to grow beyond live life in Quebec. And if you want to hire a bilingual person in Canada, in Montreal or Quebec today, it's often the Anglophones that are the ones that are bilingual, because they're forced to be bilingual, but the Francophones are unilingual French. And it's almost as if they're harming people. And, you take a look at, who was the former leader of the Bloc Québécois, whose kids all were bilingual and went to English school.
I do not disagree with you at all. You're speaking to someone who, like my grandfather, who was English, and bless his soul, he was, proudly English. Let's put it that way. He married a poor French Canadian woman, and he adored the French Canadian people and the culture, while he, sort of disparaged them and insisted that his children go to English school. I mean, there's a lot of, it's almost like, well, let's take the French people that you're talking about. I think you can't put a blanket over all of the French and you have ones who clearly understand that a bilingual person is going to have a better chance at success regardless, right? Whatever the two languages are. a person who is perfectly bilingual French and English has a lot more options and a lot more doors open, right? We know that that person can leave Montreal and go thrive anywhere in North America, versus the French person who doesn't speak a word of any other language but French. So I think you're going to find, as with anywhere, you have French people or families who are absolutely 100% French only. And yeah, I don't disagree. I don't know if I would say it's harmful, but yes, it's limiting. And then I'm sure there are many French people who understand the benefits of being bilingual. So I think it's very nuanced. It's not black and white. I mean, things like the sign laws when I can't even read about it anymore, it drives me nuts, makes me crazy, because anyway, we don't need to talk about the smoked meat anymore, but the smoked meat, Schwartz's Deli and all of that controversy. But I think, did these French laws maybe curb the growth of the potential of the city and the province? Maybe. But would the French language be alive and flourishing? I don't know.
I think the French language would be alive and flourishing, and Montreal would be more alive and flourishing, and it would be a beacon to the world of the benefits of diversity and bilingualism and biculturalism and everything else. And I think it's a shame it's gone from a place where the Francophones may have felt that they were put down and felt like second-class citizens, to, I think, a world where too many of my Anglophone friends say that they didn't feel welcome in Montreal anymore and they had to leave. And they were put down. And regrettably, they're in New York, Toronto, and Calgary, and none of them remain in Montreal, which was their homeland and the heritage of their forefathers. Anyway, that's my political point of view.
Do you think that there would have been a way for them to gain footing and be on equal footing with the English without going to the lengths that they had to go to?
Well, I certainly don't think the FLQ crisis and the murder of Pierre Laporte, was that?
Yeah, no, of course not that, but just in general, the laws and the Bill 101 and the.
I also don't think that separation was the right thing, and I think that it led to a huge amount of expenditure of political capital, monetary capital, and efforts that didn't in the end produce any positive results. I think having the Bloc Québécois in the federal parliament doesn't make sense, and I think we would all look down if the White Rose from Alberta and Saskatchewan or whatever became a opposition party, always there in the federal parliament, but not trying to form actual government. But I do think that bilingualism was the right thing to support. I think Pierre Trudeau may have had it right when he was trying to encourage bilingualism, and I think bicultural. I think that Montreal, I was there, as I mentioned yesterday, and I had dinner at one of my favorite restaurants, Alexander on Peel, and had steak tartare, or côté de boeuf, and it was wonderful, and something one wouldn't do and have nearly as much fun in Toronto, at least in Toronto of the 1970s or 80s. So Montreal is a beautiful city. It's a more cultural city. It is a funner city. And if you could exist in Montreal, either as a Francophone or as an Anglophone and be bilingual, I think it would have stayed the financial capital of Canada till today. But because it became a Francophone predominant city and Anglophones and Anglophone businesses didn't feel comfortable, today it is a second-class city in Canada.
I can tell you that I'd be there for sure. I'd still be there. My mom still would have been there. Like, I agree with you.
I have cousins and second cousins in Toronto that came from Montreal. I have cousins that came from Nuns Island or Ile de Sour that are in Calgary. I have cousins in Boston. I have cousins in aunts and uncles in New York. And the last of all of my extended family relatives left about 2 weeks ago to move to Toronto.
I mean, I try not to think about it too often because it makes me like when I go home, and I still call it home. I've been here for 20 years, but when I go home and my dad's still there, I feel sad. I have two friends left there, right? I have no family left there. And on my dad's side, I have a couple of cousins on my mom. Like it's scattered, and it's, of course it makes me sad that I go for a high school reunion and not one person is living there.
I was in a meeting yesterday with a bunch of people in Montreal, and I said that I grew up in Montreal in the West Island, and they said, "Where?" And I said, "Beaconsfield," and they said, "Oh, Beaconsfield, Ontario." Beaconsfield is known as an Anglophone, or was known as an Anglophone enclave within the island of Montreal. We're chatting with Joanna Goodman about two books that she wrote, The Forgotten Daughter and The Home for Unwanted Girls, one about the Duplessis era and one about the separatist era. We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Having a fascinating conversation tonight with Joanna Goodman, who is an author of numerous different books, but we've been talking about two of them, The Home of Unwanted Girls and The Forgotten Daughter. One, The Home for Unwanted Girls, a story about a time period in Canada, in Quebec, called the Duplessis kids, where orphans were declared to be mental health patients. Sounds unbelievable. And The Forgotten Daughter, a time period during separation where separatists, where English and French were having some dramatic difficulties in Montreal. But you say, Joanna, that they end up both being inspirational and having hope in the end. How come?
Yeah. Well, first of all, from a very pragmatic point of view, you never want to leave a reader depressed and hopeless and closing the book and, going off into a corner and crying. So I think as a writer, it's really important to, leave a reader with a little hope for what's coming. I try not to wrap it up in a tidy bow in any of my novels. Like obviously the story of a Duplessis orphan, there's only so much happy ending you can do without being phony and fake and contrived and frankly insulting. So, I had to bear that in mind, like walking a very fine line between being realistic about it. A woman who has grown up in a mental institution and endured the kind of abuse that they did, I can't just end tritely. But so for me, it was this balance of how can I leave the readers and me with a feeling of hopefulness. And I wanted to achieve that with both books. And I think
I got to ask you, with all of the news about residential schools and unmarked graveyards and what happened and what we did collectively in Canada, not just the Catholic Church, but the Catholic Church and other churches and the federal government and provincial governments, et cetera, with our Indigenous population. Are there parallels? Is there similarities between the two?
Oh yeah. The similarities, the parallels are striking. And interestingly, when I was touring with Home for Unwanted Girls, a lot of people who asked questions asked me about the residential schools. And this is a lot like the residential schools. And this was before all of this has come to life with the graveyards. There are the obvious parallels of, the powerlessness of whether it's an orphan or, an Indigenous child, the powerlessness in the face of whether it's the Catholic Church or the government or, a school system trying to beat out the culture from you. I think that the biggest similarity is that profound, heartbreaking powerlessness and the exploitation of these children, whether they were the orphans or the kids in the residential schools. I mean, the other obvious parallels are the horrific, violent, psychological and physical abuse that all of them experienced.
How can people do this to other people?
I can't answer. There's no amount of research in the world that can lead you or bring you to a satisfying answer. To me, it comes down to a gross misuse of power.
Let me ask you about your other book, The Separatist Era, and you talked about the night of the referendum vote and the riots.
Yeah.
Was that the night that Jacques Parizeau made his
yes
racist comments?
Yes. Same night. Yep.
Do you
I remember being there in the metropolis and being stunned, and like a hush fell on the whole audience, and everyone was like, did he just say that?
What did he say? Really... Remind us what he said.
Oh my God. What did he say? He's something to the effect of, we lost tonight because of the rich Anglos and the Jews. I mean, it was basically something to that effect.
I think he said we lost because of money and the ethnics.
Yeah, money and the ethnics. Right. As a Jew, I heard Jew. But yeah, that's what he said. It was, I mean, and this was like, how many years ago? 25 years ago? Before, it was shocking then. And it was,
it's still shocking today.
It's still shocking. It would be triply shocking now because we're so much more woke, right? And so much more aware. But I remember then just looking at my boyfriend and saying, who again is now my husband, and saying like, did he just say the word ethnics? Like, it was shocking.
In the last election, the Conservatives did not win many votes in the 905 circling Toronto or comparable sort of circles around Vancouver, Montreal. A lot of those circles thought of as sort of where a lot of ethnic people live, a lot of our diverse populations live. If the Conservatives said we lost because of ethnics, they would have been called racist, wouldn't they?
Yeah. I mean, absolutely, they would have. If they would have said we lost because of the LGBTQ community, they would have been, taken to task for that as well. That would have been equally as appropriate to say.
But while Parizeau was criticized in Canada, he wasn't criticized by Francophones.
Yeah, it's so complicated. It's so complicated. To me, the two solitudes is just the most profoundly accurate way to capture how the province of Quebec, it summarizes it, it symbolizes.
And yet, my grandfather who lived in Westmount Square, actually he didn't, his wife lived in Westmount Square, but after he passed away, he lived in the Acadia Court, Sherbrooke and Peel, I think it was, had season tickets to the Montreal Canadiens. And we saw it then, and we saw it in this last month when the Montreal Canadiens made a Stanley Cup attempt. Les Habitants brought people together, brought the two solitudes together, and they loved that hockey team, whether French or English.
True.
So there are some things that can bring us together.
Yeah, that's why it is so complicated. And so, you're going
to have to write another book that's sort of future looking.
Possibly.
If people are interested in your book, Joanna, how can they buy it?
The books are available everywhere books are sold. Indigo, Amazon, Chapters, everywhere.
Thank you so much, Joanna Goodman, for joining us. Author of The Forgotten Daughter and The Home for Unwanted Girls, two incredibly interesting books. I'm really honored to chat with you tonight and to hear the stories of these two books and to hear your story, which sounds frankly inspirational as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Well, that's our show for tonight. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Good night.